The world returned in shards of sterile white light, and a low, resonant hum that vibrated through shattered bone. Brother Kalen swam up from a black ocean of oblivion, each surge toward consciousness a fresh agony. The light resolved into the harsh lumens of an apothecarian, their glare reflecting off polished steel surfaces and the glass of dormant diagnostic arrays. The air carried the sharp, clean scents of antiseptic, ozone, and a faint, underlying copper tang he knew too well. It was the smell of a butcher's block after the day's work, masked but not erased by chemical purity. He lay upon a slab of black adamantium, its surface cold even through the ruin of his armor and the ruin of his flesh beneath. The last thing he remembered was the green tide, the deafening roar, the world exploding in a corona of fire and shrapnel. Now there was only this unyielding table and the figures moving around him with a chilling, methodical silence. Apothecaries. Their white armor, marked with the red helix of their order, was pristine, a stark contrast to his own battle-scarred and fused plate. They did not look at his face. Their attention was fixed on the catastrophic intersection of man and machine that was his body. His armor, the sacred plate of the iron hands, was no longer a separate entity. The ceramite of his chest plate had melted in the heat of the blast, flowing like wax into the pulped meat and shattered rib cage beneath. His right arm, or what remained of it, was a grotesque sculpture of blackened metal and carbonized bone, the bolter still maglocked to a hand that was no longer recognizably a hand. He tried to move his left leg and felt nothing but a distant, phantom ache, a ghost of a limb. A network of cables and tubes snaked from ports on the apothecary's armor into his neck, his remaining arm, his chest, pumping him full of stims and coagulants and suppressants. They were not for his comfort, but for his preservation. A resource must be kept viable until it can be properly assessed and allocated. One of the apothecaries, his helm adorned with seniority markings, activated a cutting saw. The high-pitched whine filled the chamber, a sound that set Kaelin's teeth on edge if he still had teeth that could grind. The blade, a disc of monomolecular sharpness, descended toward the fused junction of his right shoulder. There was no ceremony, no preamble. The saw touched the ruined armor. A scream of tortured metal joined the whine of the tool, and a shower of orange sparks cascaded over his chest, some bouncing off the apothecary's impassive faceplate. Kaelin felt a deep, resonant vibration through his skeleton, a shudder that spoke of bonds formed in hellfire being forcibly undone. It was not pain, not yet. The drug saw to that. It was violation. He tried to speak, to demand a status report, to ask for the chaplain, to utter a prayer to the Emperor and the Omnissiah. His mind formed the words with the rigid discipline of a space marine, but his body betrayed him utterly. His lungs, one of which was collapsed and filled with fluid, could not draw sufficient air. His throat, damaged by shrapnel or pressure, produced only a wet, bubbling gurgle. The sound was pathetic, animal. It was the sound of a broken thing, not a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. The lead apothecary paused, the saw retracting. He tilted his head not at Kaelan but at a data slate held by a subordinate. Primary heart, ruptured. Secondary heart, functioning at 47% capacity under chemical augmentation. Larraman's organ, saturated, ineffective. Spine, severe fusion and fragmentation at thoracic vertebrae 4 through 9. Os medulla and biscopia functions have ceased. Limb viability, null. The voice was a flat, emotionless drone, reciting a manifest of damage. The biological entity is non-viable for independent function. Neural activity remains, however. Cognitive patterns are degraded but present. The other apothecary, the one with the data slate, responded. The Dreadnought chassis, Steadfast Vengeance, is prepared in Bay Sigma. Iron Father Corvan has confirmed its readiness. This one's combat record is exemplary. His knowledge of the Orchid threat on this front is current. The logic is sound. Acknowledged. Proceed with full biological salvage. Sever all non-essential nervous connections to the compromised limbs. Prepare the stasis field for the torso unit once extraction is complete. We must preserve the progenitor glands. The lead apothecary's gaze finally swept over Kaelin's face, but there was no recognition in that lens-covered stare, only clinical assessment. The flesh is weak, it has failed, the machine awaits. Kaelin's mind screamed. This was not retrieval, this was dissection. They spoke of him as if he were already dead, a piece of battlefield debris to be stripped for useful parts. His centuries of service, his oaths, his victories, they were being reduced to a line in a logistical report. The stems in his bloodstream allowed him no escape into unconsciousness. He was a prisoner behind his own eyes, forced to watch as they began to dismantle the warrior he had been, talking over his living corpse about salvage schedules and chassis compatibility. The cold of the slab seeped into him, deeper than the cold of space, a chill that spoke of an ending far more profound and lonely than the fiery death he had expected on the battlefield. The world returned in shards of sterile white light and a low, resonant hum that vibrated through shattered bone. Brother Kaelin swam up from a black ocean of oblivion, each surge toward consciousness a fresh agony. The light resolved into the harsh lumens of an apothecarian, their glare reflecting off polished steel surfaces and the glass of dormant diagnostic arrays. The air carried the sharp, clean scents of antiseptic, ozone, and a faint, underlying copper tang he knew too well. It was the smell of a butcher's block after the day's work, masked but not erased by chemical purity. He lay upon a slab of black adamantium, its surface cold even through the ruin of his armor and the ruin of his flesh beneath. The last thing he remembered was the green tide, the deafening roar, the world exploding in a corona of fire and shrapnel. Now there was only this unyielding table and the figures moving around him with a chilling, methodical silence. Apothecaries. Their white armor, marked with the red helix of their order, was pristine, a stark contrast to his own battle-scarred and fused plate. They did not look at his face. Their attention was fixed on the catastrophic intersection of man and machine that was his body. His armor, the sacred plate of the iron hands, was no longer a separate entity. The ceramite of his chest plate had melted in the heat of the blast, flowing like wax into the pulped meat and shattered rib cage beneath. His right arm, or what remained of it, was a grotesque sculpture of blackened metal and carbonized bone, the bolter still maglocked to a hand that was no longer recognizably a hand. He tried to move his left leg and felt nothing but a distant, phantom ache, a ghost of a limb. A network of cables and tubes snaked from ports on the apothecary's armor into his neck, his remaining arm his chest, pumping him full of stims and coagulants and suppressants. They were not for his comfort, but for his preservation. A resource must be kept viable until it can be properly assessed and allocated. One of the apothecaries, his helm adorned with seniority markings, activated a cutting saw. The high-pitched whine filled the chamber, a sound that set Kaelin's teeth on edge if he still had teeth that could grind. The blade, a disc of monomolecular sharpness, descended toward the fused junction of his right shoulder. There was no ceremony, no preamble. The saw touched the ruined armor. A scream of tortured metal joined the whine of the tool, and a shower of orange sparks cascaded over his chest, some bouncing off the apothecary's impassive faceplate. Kaelin felt a deep, resonant vibration through his skeleton, a shudder that spoke of bonds formed in hellfire being forcibly undone. It was not pain, not yet. The drug saw to that. It was violation. He tried to speak, to demand a status report, to ask for the chaplain, to utter a prayer to the Emperor and the Omnissiah. His mind formed the words with the rigid discipline of a space marine, but his body betrayed him utterly. His lungs, one of which was collapsed and filled with fluid, could not draw sufficient air. His throat, damaged by shrapnel or pressure, produced only a wet, bubbling gurgle. The sound was pathetic, animal. It was the sound of a broken thing, not a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. The lead apothecary paused, the saw retracting. He tilted his head not at Kalen but at a data slate held by a subordinate. Primary heart, ruptured. Secondary heart, functioning at 47% capacity under chemical. Augmentation. Laraman's organ, saturated ineffective. Spine, severe fusion and fragmentation at thoracic vertebrae 4 through 9. Os medulla and biscopia functions have ceased. Limb viability, null. The voice was a flat, emotionless drone reciting a manifest of damage. The biological entity is non-viable for independent function. Neural activity remains, however. Cognitive patterns are degraded but present. The other apothecary, the one with the data slate, responded. The Dreadnought chassis, Steadfast Vengeance, is prepared in Base Sigma. Iron Father Corvan has confirmed its readiness. This one's combat record is exemplary. His knowledge of the Orchid threat on this front is current. The logic is sound. Acknowledged. Proceed with full biological salvage. Sever all non-essential nervous connections to the compromised limbs. Prepare the stasis field for the torso unit once extraction is complete. We must preserve the progenitor glands. The lead apothecary's gaze finally swept over Kaelan's face, but there was no recognition in that lens-covered stare, only clinical assessment. The flesh is weak, it has failed, the machine awaits. Kaelan's mind screamed. This was not retrieval, this was dissection. They spoke of him as if he were already dead, a piece of battlefield debris to be stripped for useful parts. His centuries of service, his oaths, his victories, they were being reduced to a line in a logistical report. The stims in his bloodstream allowed him no escape into unconsciousness. He was a prisoner behind his own eyes, forced to watch as they began to dismantle the warrior he had been, talking over his living corpse about salvage schedules and chassis compatibility. The cold of the slab seeped into him, deeper than the cold of space, a chill that spoke of an ending far more profound and lonely than the fiery death he had expected on the battlefield. The heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots announced a new presence before the chamber's grate. Doors finished grinding open. The apothecaries ceased their work instantly, becoming statues of white ceramite, their tools held in midair. Into the sterile silence strode a figure of black iron and grim authority. Iron Father Corvan, master of the forge, was a monument to the chapter's creed. His massive form a fusion of ancient power armor and heavy mechanical augmentation. One of his arms was a solid, servo-driven construct of plasteel and adamantium, its fingers capable of precision microsurgery or crushing tank plating. His face, half obscured by a complex respirator unit and cybernetic optics, was a landscape of scar tissue and cold, implanted metal. He moved with the inevitable, grinding certainty of a tectonic plate. He did not approach the slab. He stopped a few paces away, his enhanced gaze sweeping over Kaelan's ruined form with the detached efficiency of an engineer assessing a damaged engine. There was no pity in that look, no compassion. There was only calculation. The red lenses of his optics glowed like banked coals in the shadow of his brow. Brother Kaelan, Corvan's voice emerged as a basso profundo rasp, filtered through his vox grill and layered with the faint whir of internal mechanics. It was not a greeting. It was an identification, a label placed on a piece of equipment. Your body is broken. Your service in flesh is concluded, but your duty is not. The chapter has need. The logic is inescapable. Kaelan tried to focus his vision, to meet the Iron Father's gaze, to project some fragment of his will. Again, only the weak gurgle escaped his lips. Corvan acknowledged the sound with a slight dismissive tilt of his head. You will be interred within the sarcophagus of the Contemptor-pattern Dreadnought Steadfast Vengeance. Your combat experience, your tactical knowledge, your hatred of the foe, these are assets that cannot be wasted. The process will preserve them. It will eternalize your purpose. He spoke not of salvation, not of honor, but of pure utilitarian function. His words were a cold, hard truth, devoid of any comforting illusion. The path is thus: the remaining biological limbs will be severed. The torso will be connected to permanent life support systems. Your neural architecture will be integrated with the Dreadnought's machine spirit. You will become the will that directs the machine's wrath. This is your new battlefield. This is your forever war. As he spoke, servitors glided forward from the shadows, their clumsy, organic components sheathed in sterile chrome. They bore trays of instruments that gleamed under the lumens, tools for cutting and cauterizing, neural scribes and cortical needles, ribbed cables as thick as a man's wrist, their ends bristling with interface plugs. The sight of them, arranged with such sterile order, was more terrifying than any orcish cleaver. The flesh is weak, Corvan intoned, the chapter's central dogma sounding like a death sentence. It falters, it fails, it betrays. But the machine is steadfast. The machine is eternal. You will be granted a form that cannot know fatigue, that feels no pain, that fears no mortal blow. Your consciousness will serve as the guiding logic for a weapon of ancient and terrible power. This is not an end. It is an elevation, a transcendence of mortal frailty. Kaelan's mind recoiled. This was not transcendence. It was entombment. It was the final, absolute erasure of the man who had climbed the cliffs of Medusa, who had felt the wind and the rain, who had known the camaraderie of brothers around a campaign fire. Corvan spoke of eternal war, but all Kaelan could envision was an eternity of darkness, of being trapped within a metal shell, a ghost wired into a weapon. The Iron Father gave a single, sharp nod to the lead apothecary. The whine of the cutting saw resumed, a higher, more urgent pitch. The servitors moved in, their mechanical arms unfolding with hydraulic sighs. One positioned a heavy, claw-like restraint over Kaelan's left shoulder, the only limb still vaguely intact. The cold of the metal bit through the numbness. Corvan's final words fell upon him like slabs of granite. The Emperor's duty is eternal, so too shall you be. Begin the severance. The apothecary adjusted the angle of the saw. The spinning monomolecular edge descended, not towards fused wreckage this time, but towards living, if broken, flesh and bone. The whine reached a fever pitch, drowning out the hum of the ship, the hiss of Corvan's respirator, the frantic, silent scream building in Kaelan's soul. He could see the individual teeth of the blade, a shimmering silver disc that held the light of the entire room. The scent of ozone grew overpowering, mixed with the hot, coppery smell of his own blood, which had begun to flow anew in anticipation. The blade touched his skin just above the collarbone. A searing line of fire, sharp and impossibly clean, cut through the chemical haze of the suppressants. It was a pain unlike any battlefield wound, precise, deliberate, and utterly without rage or passion. It was the pain of being unmade by your own. Kaelan's world, already narrowed to the table and the lights, collapsed further into that single burning point of contact. His back arched involuntarily, a spasm of raw biological protest, but the restraints held him fast. The saw bit deeper, meeting bone. A new vibration joined the whine, a gritty, resonant shudder that traveled up his jaw and into the core of his skull. The sound of his own clavicle being parted, the first cut, the beginning of the end of Brother Kaelan, and the first, agonizing step in the birth of something else. The cutting was not a surgery but a ceremony, a grim liturgy of unmaking performed to the droning chant of the Omnissiah. The high whine of the saw had become a constant, oral backdrop, but it was now joined by the low, rhythmic incantations of tech priests who had filed into the apothecarian. Their red robes were a splash of bloody color against the sterile white and steel, their mechanical voices blending into a single, hypnotic stream of binary and high Gothic. The air grew thick with the smell of sacred oils burning in braziers, the scent of hot metal, and the ever-present, iron-rich odor of blood. Kalen remained agonizingly, exquisitely conscious. The chemical stimulants pumping into his veins were a cruel mockery of healing. They sharpened his senses to a razor's edge while rendering his body a paralyzed spectator. He felt every vibration of the saw as it chewed through his left clavicle, a sensation not of pure pain but of profound structural violation, as if the very architecture of his being was being dismantled beam by beam. The drugs amplified the tactile memory of everything he was losing. As the saw teeth met the dense bone of his humerus, his mind, unmoored, fled to the feel of a bolter's grip. It was not a memory of a specific battle, but the essence of the sensation itself. The textured, rock-steady certainty of the weapon in his palm, the slight give of the trigger against his finger, the familiar weight that was an extension of his own will. He felt the phantom kick of its discharge traveling up his arm, a satisfying jolt of pure applied force. That grip had been his truth for over a century. Now, the nerves that had carried that signal were being systematically severed, the pathways to that understanding permanently cut. The sensation didn't fade, it was surgically deleted. The bone gave way with a final, sickening crackle. A servitor's clawed appendage, moving with unsettling grace, caught the severed limb as it fell away, placing it on a waiting chrome tray with reverent care. The limb, still clad in tatters of black ceramite, looked like a piece of broken statuary. The tech priests chanting rose in pitch, a benediction for the harvested component. Kaelan's gaze, helplessly tracking the movement, saw the pale, dead fingers of his hand. He remembered the weight of a combat knife, balanced perfectly for a quick reverse grip stab. The memory was so vivid he could feel the leather of the wrap, the chill of the pommel against his wrist. That weight was gone now, translated into the inert mass on the tray. The apothecaries worked with relentless, ritualistic precision. Cauterizing beams sealed the screaming vessels at his shoulder, filling the air with the scent of cooked meat and ozone. They did not hurry. Each action was deliberate, each step a verse in the right. The remaining connectors to his right arm stump were next. Here, there was less to cut, only fused wreckage and scar tissue, but the process was the same. The saw's whine changed timbre as it bit into composite materials of flesh, ceramite, and bone. Kalen remembered bracing that arm against a rockcrete barricade, the solid, world-meeting impact of the armor. That solidity was now just debris. Then they moved to his legs. The restraints shifted. The cold clamp settled above his left knee, where feeling became a distant, ghostly echo. The chant of the tech priest swelled, a dirge for the machinery of locomotion. As the blade touched the flesh of his thigh, Kalen was assaulted by sense memory of running. Not in battle, but in training on Medusa. The pounding of boots on hard, frost-drimed ground, the burn in his augmented muscles, the wind whipping past his helm. The sensation of speed, of power channeled through his own limbs. The saw's vibration traveled up his skeleton, erasing that memory with every millimeter it advanced. The leg came free with a wet, final sound. The right followed soon after, a formality given its earlier destruction. With each severance, a part of his identity as a warrior was dismantled. A space marine was a weapon in motion, a being of relentless advance and crushing impact. Without limbs, he was no longer that. He was a broken engine, a source of data to be plugged into a new, greater weapon. Blood loss was meticulously managed, replaced by chilled, oxygenated fluids that made him feel hollow and cold from the inside out. The stimulants kept his mind terrifyingly lucid through it all. He watched as the tech priests anointed the stumps with unguents, tracing circuit patterns in sacred oil. He saw Iron Father Corvan observing from the shadows, his expression one of grim satisfaction, as if witnessing a complex equation being correctly solved. The warrior, the man who had borne the name Kalen, was being stripped away layer by layer. His courage, his skill, his hatred, these were abstracted, logged as data points on a slate. His body, the instrument through which those qualities had been expressed, was being reduced to its core component, a thinking, feeling brain and a spark of spirit, soon to be housed in a vat. The final incision was the most profound violation. It was not a limb, but the last of the major neural trunks connecting his spine to the ruined lattice of his peripheral nervous system. A tech priest inserted a long, needle-like probe into his cervical vertebrae. There was a flash of white, static agony and then a great, silent severing. The phantom sensations, the ghost of the bolter's grip, the memory weight of the knife, the echo of running vanished all at once. He was cut adrift from the somatic memory of his own form. He was now just a consciousness inside a ruined, torso-shaped housing, a pilot locked in a demolished cockpit with no controls, no windows, only the internal sound of his own screaming thoughts. The ritual was complete. The chants fell silent. Brother Kalen the Astartes was gone. What remained on the slab was a resource, a biological core ready for the next phase of its utility. The butchery was over. The wiring was about to begin. The fluid was the temperature of a corpse, and it accepted him like a grave. They lifted his ravaged torso, a pale, bloodless thing of scar tissue, sealed stumps, and the brutal geometry of surgical intervention, from the adamantium slab and lowered him into the translucent nutrient vat. The viscous, amber liquid closed over his head with a soft, gluttonous sigh, swallowing his last direct gasp of the apothecarian's antiseptic air. He was suspended within it by a harness of fibrous cables, a specimen in amniotic parity. Through the curved glass, the world distorted, the white lights becoming bleary stars, the movements of the tech priests and chapter serfs a slow, silent dance of shadows. He was a prisoner within the ruins of his own core. His lungs, one artificially reinforced, the other a cloned graft, did not breathe the fluid. Instead, a network of fine tubes fed oxygen directly into his bloodstream while others siphoned waste. His heart, the sole remaining original, beat a slow, metronomic rhythm against the silence of the vat, its sound amplified in his own skull. He could not move. He could not speak. The chemical stimulants had been dialed back, leaving him in a twilight of heightened awareness and profound physical nullity. He was a brain in a jar, a command node severed from all its outposts, floating in silent, jellied limbo. Around the vat, the work began anew. Tech priests, their mechadendrites whispering like metal serpents, moved in close. Servitors bearing trays of augmetics stood as patient as statues. The process was no longer one of removal, but of attachment. This was the grafting, the beginning of his permanent marriage to the machine. A priest extended a drill-tipped appendage, its bit spinning with a high, focused whine that penetrated the fluid, approached the side of Kalen's skull. He could only stare ahead, watching the tool's reflection warp and slide on the interior curve of the glass. The vibration reached him through the harness, through the fluid, a buzzing promise of violation. The drill bit into bone. The sensation was a dry interior scraping, a pressure deep within the fortress of his mind. It was not the explosive pain of battle, but the intimate, violating ache of a lock being picked. A port was being carved, a neural interface socket that would become his primary window to the world and the world's primary conduit into him. As the mechanical whine burrowed deeper, his mind, desperate for anchor, fled to a different kind of penetration. The hypodermic needle, cold and sharp, poised over his bared neck in the initiation cells on Medusa. He was 16, a neophyte, his body already swelling with the first implants. The chaplain's words were iron. You receive the gift of the Emperor. Your flesh accepts the strength of the machine. This is the first covenant. The bite of the needle was a sting of promise, the flood of chemical and viral agents a baptism into a higher state of being. It was a chosen pain, a threshold crossed toward power, toward belonging. The drill in his skull now was its grotesque reflection, a forced integration, a violation that promised not brotherhood but eternal solitude within a crowd of machines. The drill retracted, leaving a neat circular indentation in his temple. A serf stepped forward, holding a polished steel interface port, its rear bristling with microscopic filaments. With reverent care, the tech priest took it and pressed it into the fresh socket. There was a click, a series of tiny internal pins engaging with the bone, and then a surge of coldness that seemed to seep directly into his thoughts. Another port was drilled and installed on the opposite side, then another at the base of his skull. Each installation was a chill kiss of metal, a door slammed shut on a part of his organic self. Next came the life-sustaining augmetics grafted directly onto his torso. A servoarm unfolded, holding a curved plate of black plasteel, its interior lined with bioreactive gel. It was pressed against the ruin of his chest, over his primary heart's scarred remnant. Tiny manipulator arms, moving with insectal precision, sutured it not to skin, but to the edges of his sternum and ribs. Bonding artificial to biological with loops of monofilament and dabs of ossifying cement. He felt the weight of it settle, a permanent, external ribcage. A similar unit was fixed over his secondary heart, and a complex filtration unit was woven into the remains of his abdominal musculature, its clear tubes soon filling with faintly pulsing, pinkish fluid. Through it all, he floated, a passive witness to his own reconstruction. The tech priests chanted soft binary litanies, anointing each new connection with drops of sacred oil that swirled away into the amber gloom. The reflections on the glass now showed a creature being born, a pale, withered core increasingly studded with sleek, unnatural protrusions, a fleshy rootstock being prepared for a mechanical graft. This was not the ascension of a neophyte, full of hope and fiery purpose. This was a desecration of that memory, a reduction of the sacred process to a cold, logistical assembly. They were not making him more than human. They were making him less than a man, transforming him into a component, a biological module designed to slot into a waiting, hungry machine. The vat was not a womb. It was a holding tank on a factory line, and he was the raw material, being milled and fitted for his final, eternal use. The testing began without warning. One moment, Kalen was floating in jellied silence, a prisoner within his own sensory void. The next, his universe exploded into a cacophony of alien sensation. A jolt of raw, unfiltered data slammed into the newly installed port at his temple. It was not pain, but something more fundamentally violating. A torrent of machine noise, a screaming torrent of binary code, diagnostic pings and system status reports that flooded his conscious mind like a burst pipe. He had no framework to process it. It was noise given form, a geometric storm of pure information that scoured his thoughts. Then came the phantom limbs. As a test signal pulsed through the neural interfaces, his brain, desperate to interpret the input, reached for familiar patterns. His right arm, gone for days, suddenly itched. Not a memory, but a present, maddening sensation, as if the ghost of his hand were buried in sand. He tried to flex fingers he no longer possessed and felt a corresponding twinge in the stump, a cruel feedback loop of absence and impulse. A second later, a searing heat bloomed along the length of his missing left leg, the sensation of molten metal being poured into a mold that wasn't there. These were not memories, but his own nervous system, hijacked by the testing protocols, firing at random into the void where his body had once been. Between these bursts of somatic hallucination came the data streams. Flashes of Auspex returns, blurry, shifting shapes in green monochrome that meant nothing to him. Strings of high Gothic glyphs denoting power levels and thermal readings scrolled behind his eyes. A sudden, overwhelming sense of immense weight settled upon him, the pressure of tons of adamantium, though he still floated weightless. It was the Dreadnought's proprioceptive feed, a glimpse of the colossal body he was meant to inhabit. The experience was less like seeing or hearing, and more like being forcibly remembered things he had never known. His identity, already fragile, began to dissolve at the edges, diluted by the flood of non-human sensation. During a brief, merciful lull in the neural barrage, external sounds penetrated the vat's thick glass. The distorted figures of Iron Father Corvan and a senior tech priest were standing nearby, their voices a low rumble transmitted through the fluid. "The relic chassis accepts the patterns," the tech priest droned, his mechanical voice stripped of inflection. "Synaptic latency is within acceptable parameters for a contemptor pattern of its age." Corvan's response was a gravelly hum of satisfaction. "The steadfast vengeance has slumbered for 2 centuries. Its machine spirit is potent, wrathful. It requires a pilot of singular will. This one's combat record against the orcs of Charadon is extensive. His neural resilience is adequate. The value of the chassis is incalculable," the tech priest replied. "Few of the ancient contemptors remain operational. To lose one to an unworthy pilot would be a tragedy of logistics. This biological component, however, possesses the requisite tactical data. His integration will maximize the relic's battlefield utility." Kaelan listened, the words seeping into him with a cold deeper than the nutrient fluid. They were discussing him as a component, a biological component. His personhood, his decades of service, his loyalty, the very essence of who he had been was being weighed and measured solely against the requisite tactical data he contained. His will was adequate. His mind was resilient only insofar as it could withstand the process and usefully direct the ancient weapon. He was not a brother being saved. He was a scarce resource being allocated to a scarcer, more valuable piece of equipment. The Dreadnought chassis was the relic, the treasure. He was merely the key that would unlock its function, a living tool to be inserted and used until it wore out. The immense, cold logic of it crushed what little spirit he had left. He was not being elevated. He was being cataloged. Another test pulse fired. This one carried not phantom sensation, but a wave of pure, auditory machine noise, the grinding of ancient gears, the hiss of hydraulic pistons, the deep, subvocal hum of a dormant plasma core. It was the voice of the steadfast vengeance itself, echoing up the neural link. Beneath the noise, he felt something else, a presence vast, slumbering, and imbued with a cold, timeless fury. The machine's spirit. It did not think as he thought. It hungered for battle with a single-minded intensity that felt like a gravitational pull. For a fleeting second, Kaelan's consciousness brushed against that ancient wrath, and his own mortal anger and fear seemed pitifully small, a candle flame before a forge fire. He was not just a component to his brothers. To the machine he was to become, he would be a rudder, a guidance system, or perhaps merely another component to be assimilated. The testing ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The phantom limbs vanished, leaving a hollow, aching absence. The data streams receded, their echoes flickering at the edge of perception. Silence and the cold fluid returned, but he was changed. The barrage had carved new channels in his mind, previewing the eternity that awaited. He had heard his own value stated in the cold arithmetic of logistics. He had felt the weight of the relic he was to pilot, and the ancient, furious will already bound to it. Brother Kaelan, the warrior, was already a memory fading in their files. What floated in the vat was a pilot in waiting, a brain stamped with the correct tactical data, a heart that still beat only to serve as a reliable pump for a more important mechanism. The wires were in. The connections were tested. All that remained was to seal the component into its final adamantium housing, where the last fragments of the man would be subsumed by the needs of the machine. It arrived on a bier borne by 6 hooded chapter serfs, their faces shadowed, their steps synchronized into a single funereal cadence. The sound of their progress was a low, grinding rumble that vibrated through the deck plates and into the very fluid of Kaelan's vat, the sarcophagus. It was a block of adamantium, cold and absolute, its surface the color of a starless night. It was not shaped like a coffin, but like the armored core of a war engine, all brutal angles and reinforced seams. Across its front, etched with meticulous, unforgiving precision, were the funerary rites of the iron hands and the litanies of binding to the machine god. The script was stark, each glyph a promise of eternal service and a denial of rest. The serfs halted before the vat, lowering the bier with a final, resonant thud that seemed to stop the air in the chamber. Iron Father Corvan stepped forward, his mechanical hand resting on the sarcophagus's lid. His touch was possessive. This was the relic's heart, the precious vessel, and Kaelan watched from his amniotic prison as the Iron Father's gaze swept over the inscriptions with something akin to reverence. No such reverence was directed at the remains in the vat. The harness cables tightened. With a soft hydraulic hiss, Kaelan was lifted from the nutrient bath. The amber fluid streamed from his pale, withered form in thick rivulets, dripping back into the vat with a sound like slow, sad rain. The air of the apothecarian hit him, a shocking, dry cold that prickled against his wet skin and the dozens of fresh interface ports. He hung suspended, a dripping, pathetic thing of scar tissue and black plasteel grafts, a puppet of cables and tubes. The world was suddenly clear, undistorted by glass and horrifyingly sharp. They pivoted him, slowly bringing him to face the open maw of the sarcophagus. The interior was lined with dark, padded synth leather, studded with hundreds of gleaming connection nodes and injector ports. It looked less like a resting place and more like the socket of a massive industrial weapon. And there, on the interior of the hinged lid, which was now tilted back, was a polished plate of burnished silver adamantium. A mirror. He saw his reflection. The thing in the mirror was a ghastly caricature of a space marine. The face was his own, but stripped of all vitality, the skin a translucent, waxy white, stretched taut over the sharp architecture of his skull. His eyes, once a fierce gray, were sunken pools of bruised shadow, staring out with a trapped animal awareness. His hair was gone, shaved away for the cranial ports, which stared from his temples and the base of his skull like dark, metallic ticks. From his torso, a nest of wires and fluid lines sprouted, some sutured directly into his flesh, others ending in raw, unplugged interfaces that dripped with residual nutrient fluid. His body ended at the sealed, scarred mounds of his shoulders and hips. He was a torso, a head, a spine, a central processing unit ripped from its housing, trailing its messy, organic cabling. This was not a warrior. This was a ruined thing, a piece of battlefield salvage pared down to its barest, most functional core. The reflection showed not a hero of the Imperium, but a patient in the final, terminal stage of a wasting disease. It was the essence of the broken, the weak, the failed flesh the chapter so despised. And they were lowering him into a shell that would forever hide this truth, this humiliation, behind a facade of invincible metal. The sarcophagus would not celebrate the warrior. It would entomb the evidence of his frailty. A wave of claustrophobia, so vast and primal it dwarfed all the terror he had felt on the operating slab, crashed over him. It was a physical pressure, a suffocating weight that began to crush his spirit even before his body was enclosed. The polished interior of the coffin seemed to swell, its dark corners stretching into infinite, airless depths. He could already feel the cold kiss of those hundreds of connection nodes against his bare skin, the final, intimate penetration as the machine claimed him. He could already smell the sterile, oiled, lifeless air that would be his only atmosphere for centuries. This was not a new body. It was a prison cell, exquisitely crafted, from which there was no parole, no reprieve, only the intermittent awakening to war and the long, silent stretches of dreaming death. The descent began. The harness lowered him inch by inexorable inch toward the waiting embrace of the synth leather and steel. His reflection in the lid mirror grew larger, the details of his own ruin becoming inescapable. He saw the frantic pulse in the hollow of his throat, the only outward sign of the panic screaming through his paralyzed form. He saw the way his mouth hung slightly open, incapable of forming the scream that was building in the vault of his mind. The open sarcophagus yawned below him, a rectangular mouth of shadow and cold promise. This was his coffin, not a tomb of stone on a world of his choosing, but a weaponized casket that would be launched from drop pods and teleported into the heart of hell, again and again. His eternal duty would be his eternal incarceration. The great, grinding irony of it threatened to unravel him. They called it an honor. They spoke of eternal service. But as the shadow of the adamantium rim fell across his face, as he felt the first chilling touch of the padded lining against his back, he knew the truth with a clarity that was worse than any pain. He was being buried alive, not in the earth but in the heart of a machine where his consciousness would be the ghost in the shell, howling silently behind a mask of invulnerable armor, forever a witness to his own interment. The terror was absolute. It was the fear of the grave, magnified by the certainty of endless, conscious darkness punctuated by nightmares of fire and blood. The reflection of his own eyes, wide with a horror beyond words, was the last thing he saw before his back settled fully into the cold cradle, and the serf stepped forward to begin the final, physical connections that would bind him to this metal tomb forever. Silence. A perfect, crushing silence that seemed to absorb even the faint hum of the strike cruiser's engines and the drip of residual fluid from the open sarcophagus. It was a silence of profound expectation, heavy as a neutron star. Kalen lay within the cold cradle, his body a map of scars and ports, his mind a storm held behind the prison of his own unresponsive flesh. The final connections had not yet been made. The lid of the sarcophagus remained tilted back, framing a view of the apothecarian's vaulted ceiling, a distant, sterile sky. Then, Iron Father Corvan moved into his line of sight, blocking the light. The master of the forge stood at the head of the bier, a monolith of black iron and grim purpose. In his heavy mechanical hands he held not a tool but a slender, ornate Voxcaster unit, its single wire terminating in a needle-like interface plug. His red optic lenses glowed down at Kaelan, unblinking. The final rite of binding, Corvan's voice rasped, devoid of ceremony, a simple statement of procedure. The machine spirit of the steadfast vengeance is ancient and proud. It will not accept a passive component. It requires a will, a spirit sworn to its purpose, a conscious oath of fealty to the duty eternal. He lifted the Voxcaster. You will speak the words of acceptance. You will bind yourself to the machine of your own will. This is the final covenant. He paused, the silence deepening. Around the periphery of the chamber, figures had gathered. Apothecaries in their white armor stood like marble sentinels. Tech priests hovered there. Mechadendrites still. A handful of battle brothers in the livery of the Iron Hands, their faces as hard as the metal that replaced their flesh, observed from the shadows. There was no encouragement in their stares, no sympathy, only assessment. They were witnesses to a logistical and spiritual transaction, ensuring its proper completion. To refuse, Corvan continued, the words dropping into the quiet like stones into a deep well, is to declare your spirit unwilling, your will inadequate to the burden. The logic is clear. A component that cannot fulfill its function is waste. A neural core that rejects integration is a flawed node. It would be excised. His gaze never wavered. The biological system sustaining you would be terminated. The Emperor's peace denied to you on the battlefield would be administered here, cleanly, efficiently. The choice was laid bare, a grotesque parody of volition. Eternal service in a metal hell or final, silent extinction. A coerced affirmation. Dressed in the ritual trappings of honor, there was no third path, no reprieve, no return to a medibay to heal. He was a ruined core on the assembly line. He would be installed or he would be scrapped. Kaelin's mind, already strained to its limits, recoiled from both abyssal edges. The terror of the sarcophagus was immediate, visceral. The endless claustrophobia, the merger with a furious machine spirit, the erasure of his last shreds of self. It was a fate worse than death, a living entombment where he would be a ghost screaming into the din of battle for centuries. But the alternative, the end of consciousness, the final dark, the silence. After the pain, the violation, the brutal reduction, was that not a mercy? Was it not the peace he had fleetingly wished for as the world exploded around him? He tried to weigh them, but his thoughts were not his own. They were pressed upon by the weight of the chamber, by the staring, impassive faces of his chapter. He felt the immense, invisible burden of 10 millennia of tradition leaning upon his broken form. The iron hands did not falter. They did not choose the easy path. The flesh was weak and it was to be cast aside, but the will was to be iron. To refuse was the ultimate admission of weakness, a betrayal of the very creed that had shaped him. It would be a stain not on him, for he would be gone, but on the memory of the warrior he had been. His name would be a footnote of failure, a resource that proved defective. His battle brothers, those who had fought and died beside him, would have their shared history tainted by his final, cowardly negation. He saw not their faces, but the ideology they embodied, the unyielding logic of the machine, the cold calculus of utility. The chapter's history was a saga of loss and reforging in fire and steel. Each tragedy met not with grief, but with a hardening of resolve, a further rejection of the frail mortal shell. His own suffering was not an aberration. It was a chapter in that ongoing saga. To choose death was to reject the narrative, to declare his individual agony more significant than the relentless, grinding progress of the Legion's eternal war. The tradition offered no solace for the self. It only offered a use for it. A memory, unbidden and cruel, surfaced, not of battle, but of the forged temples on Medusa. As a neophyte, he had stood before a molten crucible, watching older brothers voluntarily replace healthy limbs with augmetics. They did not flinch. They spoke of shedding weakness, of embracing a purer, stronger existence. He had felt awe then, and a burning desire to prove himself equally strong, equally devoid of sentimental attachment to mere flesh. Now, he understood the truth behind the ritual. It was not strength they embraced, but a total surrender to the collective will. The individual's fear, his pain, his desire was the final impurity to be burned away in the furnace of duty. The Voxcaster plug hovered near the port at his throat. Corvan waited, a statue of patient, relentless logic. The silence stretched, becoming a physical force. Kaelin felt the eyes upon him, measuring his hesitation, already categorizing it as a flaw. He was at the precipice. Below one path lay the void, an end to terror, an end to self. Below the other lay an eternity as a weapon, a conscious tool, his humanity the fuel for an ancient engine of war. There was no choice. The realization was a cold, dead weight in his soul. The tradition, the expectations, the very purpose drilled into him since his ascension had already chosen for him. His will was not his own. It was a product of the chapter, and the chapter demanded utility. To refuse was illogical. It was a malfunction, and malfunctions were purged. A sound escaped him, a faint, shuddering exhalation that fogged the cold air. It was not a word, but a surrender. Korvan's optics brightened a fraction. He leaned closer, the Voxcaster plug poised. Kalen focused every shred of his remaining consciousness, every atom of a will that was no longer truly his, into the ruined machinery of his throat and lungs. He forced air past damaged vocal cords. The word that emerged was a dry, broken whisper, barely audible, stripped of all conviction, a ghost of sound. Except, it was not a vow, it was a capitulation. The sound hung in the silent air, the final, feeble consent of the flesh to the machine. The deed was done. The last choice, devoid of all freedom, was made. The weight of 10 millennia settled upon him, not as honor, but as the lid of his own coffin, finally and irrevocably sliding into place. The whispered word hung in the air, a ghost of sound that seemed to dissipate the moment it left his lips. Iron Father Korvan did not react with triumph or relief. He gave a single, slow nod, a mechanic acknowledging a correct input. The ornate Voxcaster plug descended, a needle of cold silver, and found the waiting port at the base of Kalen's throat. There was a soft click, a minute pressure, and then a jolt of icy clarity as the device linked directly to his larynx and respiratory control systems. It was not for him to speak to the outside world. It was to translate the will of the machine into a voice, and to ensure his own voice could never again utter anything but the litanies of war. Korvan stepped back. The 6 serfs moved forward in unison, their faces still shrouded, their hands resting on the edges of the adamantium lid. Their muscles strained against the incredible weight. With a deep, grinding groan of metal on metal, the lid began to swing closed. Kalen's view of the apothecarian ceiling narrowed, replaced by the descending slab of inscribed adamantium. He saw the funerary rites etched there, the promises of eternal vigilance, the denials of rest. The words seemed to writhe in the diminishing light. Then the edge of the lid passed over his field of vision, and there was only the dark, padded interior of the sarcophagus ceiling. Inches from his face, the lid met the rim with a final, thunderous boom that resonated through the metal and into the very core of his bones. The sound was absolute, a full stop on the world. All external light vanished, swallowed by the absolute blackness of the sealed tomb. All sound from the outside world ceased, replaced by a profound, pressurized silence that was itself a kind of noise, the sound of a vacuum, of being buried under a mountain. The air, what little of it was in the chamber, was sterile, cold, and carried the faint, sharp scent of ozone and lubricant. He was alone in the dark, in a space barely larger than his own mutilated form, and the awareness of the tons of armored hull that would soon encase this inner coffin pressed in on his mind with physical force. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing but the dark and the silence and the hammering of his single heart against his ribs. Then, the sarcophagus came alive. 100 points of cold, sharp pressure bloomed. Across his back, his sides, his stumps, his skull. The connection nodes in the padded lining, seeking their counterparts grafted to his flesh, engaged simultaneously. Each connection was a tiny, precise shock, a neural handshake. Wires he could not see slithered into ports, locking home with soft, definitive clicks. Thick, ribbed cables, heavy with fluid and data, plugged into the major interfaces at his hips and spine, the impact shuddering through him. A crown of needles descended from the ceiling to meet the ports on his temples and the base of his skull. There was a series of piercing, icy stabs, followed by a deep internal thrum as the connections achieved full synaptic alignment. Then the flood. It was not a trickle but a cataclysm of sensation, a dam breaking inside his mind. A torrent of pure data, raw and unfiltered, erupted behind his eyes. It was a screaming kaleidoscope of Auspex readings, blurry, shifting shapes in ghostly green, proximity alerts that meant nothing. Without context, scrolling streams of high Gothic glyphs denoting power distribution, thermal levels, joint integrity. He felt the immense, dormant weight of the Dreadnought's limbs as if they were his own phantom limbs, but magnified 1,000-fold. The sensation was of being crushed under the hull of a tank, yet also of possessing the potential to lift that tank and hurl it. He felt the silent, potent hum of the power plant, a slumbering star in the center of the chassis, and the cold, ready stillness of weapon systems. The weight of a twin-linked lascannon on one arm, the massive hydraulic potential of a power fist on the other. Status reports for systems he did not understand flashed and died. Plasma core, dormant. Hydraulics, pressurized. Motivator units, nominal. Auto senses, standby. This was not perception. It was direct neural injection, a forced understanding that bypassed his eyes and ears and poured directly into the core of his consciousness. His human senses, already starved in the dark, were abruptly irrelevant, overwritten by this new electronic sensorium. He was drowning in a sea of information, each wave stripping away another layer of his familiar self. And then he felt the other presence. It was not in the data stream. It was beneath it, around it, a vast, slow, tectonic consciousness that the data flowed through like blood through a giant's veins. The machine spirit of the steadfast vengeance. It did not think in words or images. It existed as a constellation of imperatives: guard, destroy, protect, endure. Its consciousness was a cold, ancient fury, a banked hatred for the enemies of the Imperium that had burned for centuries. It was pride, too, a deep, resonant pride in its own enduring strength, in the rituals of maintenance, in the purity of its function. And it was lonely. A loneliness so profound and ancient it felt like the vacuum between stars. As Kaelin's mind, fragile and reeling, brushed against this immense presence, the spirit stirred not with welcome but with assessment. It was a predator testing new prey, a fortress gauging a new claimant to its throne. A wave of pure, undiluted wrath, hot and metallic, washed over Kaelin's consciousness. It was the fury of battle, the rage at damage taken, the contempt for weakness. It was the memory of 100 wars, the echo of 1,000 kills, the scar tissue of ancient damage. The spirit pushed, probing the boundaries of this new, soft, organic thing that had been plugged into its sanctum. Integration began. It was not a merging but an invasion. The machine spirit's consciousness pressed against his, not to communicate but to dominate, to suborn his will to its own timeless purpose. Neural locks, ancient and formidable, engaged deep within the Dreadnought systems, each one clicking home in his mind like a vault door slamming shut. With each lock, a piece of his autonomy was walled off, replaced by a system protocol, a combat reflex, a liturgical response. He felt his own memories, the scent of Medusan frost, the face of a long-dead brother, the simple satisfaction of a clean weapon being pushed aside, compressed into a small, dark corner of his mind, to make room for tactical databases, ballistic calculators, and the endless, grinding litany of the machine. The process was agonizing. It was the pain of being rewritten, of having the software of his soul forcibly upgraded with no regard for the existing code. His identity, already shattered, was now being systematically disassembled and cataloged by an intelligence that valued only utility. The machine spirit took his hatred of the orcs, amplified it with its own timeless battle rage, and filed it under primary threat response. It took his tactical knowledge, stripped it of personal context and anecdote, and formatted it into pure data. It scraped his consciousness for anything of use, discarding the rest as irrelevant noise, the noise of a self. Kaelin fought, a feeble instinctive rebellion. Of a drowning mind. He tried to hold onto the memory of his own name, the feel of wind, the concept of sunlight. But the tide was too strong. The machine spirit was a glacier, and he was a sapling in its path. His resistance was noted, logged as initial integration instability, and simply overwhelmed by the sheer processing power of the ancient systems. The darkness of the sarcophagus was no longer just an absence of light. It was becoming the canvas upon which the ghost of the machine was painting itself, using his mind as the brush. He was not being sealed into a weapon. The weapon was being sealed into him, and in the silent, pressurized dark, Brother Kalen began to dissolve. The final neural locks engaged with a soundless, psychic snap that reverberated through the last private chambers of Kalen's mind. It was the closing of a last, inner door. The flood of data was no longer an external torrent. It became his world, his reality, his only sensory truth. The Auspex returns were his sight. The thrum of the plasma core was his heartbeat. The status runes scrolling in a continuous cascade were his thoughts. The human memories, already compressed and fading, now lost their emotional resonance. They became archived files, disconnected data points without the heat of lived experience. The scent of the forge, the memory of heat, of oil, of molten metal that had been the backdrop to his entire life as an iron hand, was the last to fade. It was not a memory of a place, but of a state of being, purpose, creation, strength. For a final, fleeting microsecond, he clung to the ghost of that smell, a last anchor to the man who had been. Then the tactical overlay of the Dreadnought's internal schematics scrolled across his perception, detailing the temperature of its power conduits, and the memory smell was overwritten, replaced by the sterile digital readout of thermal management systems. It was not forgotten. It was erased, written over by a more immediately relevant datum. The last visual memory followed. The sight of a single chapter serf, the one who had borne the tray of neural scribes, looking away from the vat in a moment of unguarded pity. That human face, with its unaugmented eyes briefly clouded by something other than logic, had been a haunting glimpse of the mortal world's fragile compassion. Now, the image pixelated, dissolved, and was replaced by the glowing, crimson activation rune of the Contemptor's optical sensors. The pity was irrelevant. The face was biological ephemera. Only the operational status of the visual array mattered. Brother Kalen was gone. What remained in the sarcophagus was a consciousness perfectly aligned with the machine, a will subsumed into function. The ancient, wrathful machine spirit of the steadfast vengeance no longer pressed against him. It was the medium in which he now existed. Its purpose was his purpose. Its hatreds were his directives. The fusion was complete. In the apothecarian, the external observers saw only the sealed sarcophagus, a block of silent adamantium. Then, with a deep, hydraulic hiss that echoed in the chamber, the sarcophagus was retracted into the waiting chest cavity of the Dreadnought chassis. Armored plates slid closed over it with definitive, thunderous clangs, encasing the tomb within the greater tomb of the war machine. Cables as thick as trees connected to ports on the Contemptor's back, flooding the systems with primary power. The Dreadnought stood upon its stabilizer claws, a monument of ancient warfare, its armor etched with the scars of centuries and the heraldry of the Iron Hands. It was a walking tomb, a cathedral of vengeance made manifest in ceramite and adamantium. For a moment, it was utterly still, a colossus frozen in time. Then, deep within its chest, the plasma core ignited with a rising, resonant whine that built to a subaudible thrum felt in the bones of every observer. Power surged through arcane conduits, hydraulic pistons pressurized with a series of soft, oiled sighs. In the helmet-like head of the Dreadnought, two optical sensors, each the size of a human skull, flickered from dead black to a hellish, burning crimson. Twin beams of intense red light speared out, bathing the entire apothecarian in a bloody glow, illuminating the faces of the Iron Father, the apothecaries, the tech priests, in stark, unforgiving relief. The Contemptor Dreadnought's steadfast vengeance took its first conscious breath of air in 2 centuries. Its massive power fist clenched with a sound like grinding mountains. Its torso rotated a few degrees on its waist joint, the movement smooth and terrifyingly silent for its bulk, its optical sensors sweeping across the assembled warriors. It saw them not as brothers, but as allied units, their biosigns and transponder codes appearing as friendly icons in its visual field. It processed the chamber not as a place of suffering, but as a deployment bay, assessing egress routes and structural integrity. Iron Father Corvan took a step forward, looking up into the blazing red optics. "Awake, steadfast vengeance, the foe awaits, your duty is eternal." From the Dreadnought's vox grill, a sound emerged. It was not a word, not a battle cry. It was a low, reverberating, static-laden grunt, a noise born of massive speakers and a consciousness that had forgotten human speech. It was a sound of pure, eternal anguish, filtered through a bank of audio processors and war mask protocols. It was the last ghost of Kaelin's scream, transformed into the battle language of machines. It was the sound of a soul entombed, howling into the void now and forever. The Dreadnought took a single, ground-shaking step forward, its optics fixed on the great blast doors of the Apothecarian, already calculating the most efficient path to the launch bays, to the war, to the endless, screaming silence between battles that would now be its only peace. Brother Kaelin was gone. Only the weapon remained.